went into meditating and paying attention to my habits because I needed to save myself. Like I was like, heading towards a train wreck. But in the act of saving myself and changing my life, immediately I noticed that my relationships were very surface level and that I could do something about it, that I could improve them, that as I deepen that connection with myself, I could, just have more like appreciation for my wife, like get to know her again. And like the same thing with my friends, with my mom and dad, like being able to deepen those connections. Really, it was directly tied to me being able to grow and build peace in my own mind. Yeah, so I think that bridge between personal growth and how that impacts the way you show up in your relationship and how you can learn how to love better, just feels important to talk about.
Yeah, when you say that, it just brings to mind how often we drag our history and who we think somebody is and how they should show up based off of who they've been in the past in every single moment. And in that perspective, it's like we're not actually even engaging with somebody who, as they are in the moment, we're engaging with how we want them to be, how we expect them to be. And that like just sucks intimacy out of the equation.
Yeah, because then you're like, what? I'm literally interacting with an illusion? Like I'm literally like taking all these projections, forming them, bringing them into this present moment. And then I'm not even talking to you. I'm probably talking to the person who hurt me 7 years ago. That sucks. That's not a good way to live. Yeah.
And it's why I'm so glad we started this whole conversation talking about the developing of awareness, because to the degree that we do that is to the degree we can actually be present with somebody and not just our projections of them.
Yeah. I think developing awareness just helps you honestly learn how to listen, because it's so easy to get caught in the mode where, let's say there's tension between us and you're speaking, I'm trying to listen to you, but already instead of listening to you, I'm thinking about how am I going to retort? How am I going to sort of try to prove my point using the words that you're saying, as opposed to just taking a moment to fully appreciate where you're coming from, to just suspend my need for dominance, suspend my need for, to just be right and just accept that you also have a very valid perspective. And then I should take the time to hear it. And then hopefully you'll give me that opportunity as well.
Yeah, I love that section in your book when you reflect on arguments. It's because it's something that I've thought of many times as well, where often we're under the presumption whenever arguments arise in particularly the romantic relationships, but also any conversation where we have differing opinions, we feel like it's me versus you and we're trying to win instead of trying to understand.
Yeah.
And shifting that perspective, instead of me versus you, it's us versus the problem.
Yeah. Yeah, it feels like it logically makes sense, but you have to untangle yourself from your emotions, from your reactions to be able to even try to practice that, because it's difficult. As soon as we get into an argument, we're very much so driven by our evolutionary need to survive. So when we get into an argument, we feel like we may be cast aside by the group. We may, like we're under threat in some way. So immediately we feel like we're walking into a battle, but you have to remind yourself, like, who are you arguing with? Like, I'm arguing with the person I love. This is my best friend. Like, this is my roommate. This is like the homiest of homies, like the person I love the most, So why am I acting like I'm under threat? And now let me try to shift my energy to try to do my best to see things from their perspective. And this is why, like, in this book, I talk about a very specific form of compassion where you intentionally try to let go of your perspective for a moment and step into the shoes of another person to see things from their view. And you find that when you do practice that and you're able to give that to each other, the tension evaporates. When I can really see the series of events from your point of view, and then you can see mine, we're like, oh, that's why this happened. And I think that's only something that can happen when you really try to let go of winning.
The guest we had on last week, Peter Crone, he has a saying that being right is the poor man's version of self-worth.
Oh man, that's a good one. Yeah.
And it really does feel like oftentimes, like we're not trying to get to the objective truth of truth of something. We're trying to just be right in our perspective.
Yeah.
And again, it's one of those things that's very difficult to catch in the throes of unawareness. By default, you're not aware to the function and the degree which this is happening, right?
Yeah.
But again, in the process of growing our awareness, we can see and like just question it a little bit more, you know, and just create a little bit of a crack of awareness and inquisitiveness and curiosity when faced, you know, with these difficult situations.
Yeah, I think it's really hard because the mind is so tricky. And I think when you're questioning, like, where is this coming from? You know, starts that the mind will literally jump through illogical hoops to be able to make it so that this tension that I'm feeling is your fault, even if you have nothing to do with it. And as my wife and I started, you know, we were together for a long time. We've been together for almost 17 years. The first 6 years of our relationship was before we started meditating. And that time period was highly chaotic. It felt like we were living in a hurricane. But when we started developing our individual self-awareness, we started realizing that actually, I'm not mad at you. I just don't feel good. There's like heaviness moving through me. There's some tension moving through me. And what we accidentally started practicing really out of the confine of the situation when the pandemic began, you know, we're living in our little apartment in New York City. And we were, you know, starting to get into these arguments, but then realizing, oh, like actually we're not mad at each other at all. And what we started doing instead was taking a moment when we would wake up to just tell each other immediately how we feel. And, you know, because sometimes you wake up and you don't immediately feel good. You're just like, I feel heavy or tired, or, you know, I feel a little sick. And just having these little bits of information where like you yourself are naming how you're feeling and you're making yourself aware of it and you're making your partner aware of it, it is so helpful because I felt like that decreased the amount of arguments we had probably by 80%. Because I was like, oh, like my girl just doesn't feel good today. Like, let me see how I can step up for her, how I can support her, and just like, you know, take things off her plate. And she, you know, she would also know, okay, I need to move gently through the day and vice versa. You know, whenever I would not feel good, I'm like, okay, well, let me be like gentle to myself and mindful of how I'm speaking and also mindful of the way my mind's moving because it's going to try to make this someone else's fault.
And we can only communicate to the degree we're aware of what our needs are and what our values are, right? So we have to like actually know what we need in order to be able to communicate it with another, which is the process of, you know, communication, which we're speaking to real communication versus communication out of projections and tension.
Yeah, right. Like self-awareness is really difficult without like honesty and accountability. Like, because you can pay attention to yourself, but still try to make everything someone else's fault. But really, you know, being able to own the fact that like, oh, I just don't feel that good. And it doesn't really have anything to do with you. But the mind, like emotions like to grow, you know, whether it's a positive or a negative one, it tries to just expand itself and feed itself. So the mind is always looking for more cannon fodder, and it'll just like take whatever tension you're feeling or whatever anger you're feeling and try to think of some old thing that happened, you know, a year ago. And my wife and I had this really funny moment where it just like, it hit us so hard the way the mind works, where I was working in the kitchen and she was in the living room and we were separately on our laptops for like, I think maybe like 2.5, 3 hours. And she comes into the room laughing. And she was like, I spent the last like hour trying to think of a reason to figure out why I don't feel good is your fault. And I just kept going back in time, further back in time, further back in time, just trying to rehash. And she like caught the mind as it's moving through this process. And I was like, well, and then she's laughing, right? She thought it was so funny, like seeing that inside of herself. And I was like, also being like, wow, like I do the same thing, but also I'm so grateful to you because you just saved us so many problems.
Yeah.